Welcome to the Girls in the Youth Justice System webinar, a collaboration between the Youth Justice Board and the National Children's Bureau. In this webinar, you will hear insight on the unique challenges faced by girls in the justice system and how different services work with them.
In that case, that leaves me just to open up by welcoming everybody. As you can see, hopefully that you can see on your screen, you will be aware that the webinar will be recorded, and for that reason we've decided to turn all of the cameras off other than the speakers, so it will operate more like a webinar format. So all of the cameras and microphones are disabled other than for the speakers today, but there will be an opportunity to ask questions at various points over the next few hours using the Q&A function, so please utilise that as you wish. And the recording, the slides that are shown today and some other relevant links in terms of what's going to be discussed will be shared in a follow-up along with a survey seeking some of your feedback about the event today. So hopefully that is all clear. Okay. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Hi everyone, massive welcome to everybody for this really important discussion that we're going to be having this afternoon, focused on girls in the youth justice system. It's my real pleasure to be here co-hosting with Rachel from the YJB, who's going to introduce herself shortly. My name is Pippa Goodfellow. I'm the Deputy Director of Policy, Communications and Strategy at the National Children's Bureau, and we are really delighted to be collaborating with the Youth Justice Board and with all of the brilliant array of speakers to have this really important discussion this afternoon. So I'll just tell you a little bit about the National Children's Bureau. So we bring people and organisations together to drive change in society across all aspects of childhood in the UK. And we also host a number of membership groups who draw partners together in key areas that are relevant to childhood, including the Anti-Bullying Alliance, the Childhood Bereavement Network, the Council for Disabled Children, Research in Practice, who many of you will have heard of through their work around youth justice and safeguarding, the Schools Wellbeing Partnership, and the Working Together with Parents Network. NCB has got a really rich and long history of working in the youth justice space, and we are working to increase our existing focus on children in the youth justice system as part of that really holistic look at children's lives, because we know that children who are in the youth justice system are proportionately more likely to have special educational needs and disabilities, be in touch with the social care system, have health problems, and to have been let down in their early years. So this is really an attempt to draw all of that together. So really delighted to be here and to have got to know Rachel a bit better through the process of organising today. So I'll pass over to you, Rachel, just to introduce yourself and the YJB.
Thanks, Pippa. Good afternoon, everybody. It's so nice to see so many people here, albeit a little bit daunting, but lovely to see you all here. My name's Rachel Schleicher and I am Head of Oversight for Yorkshire and Humber at the Youth Justice Board. The Youth Justice Board for England and Wales is the government body that oversees the youth justice system and the provision of youth justice services. And we do a lot of things at the YJB, but we monitor the provision for youth justice services, advise the Secretary of State on matters relating to the youth justice system, as well as promoting the voice of the child within the youth justice system, including working with a youth advisory panel. We're really delighted today to partner with the National Children's Bureau on this webinar. The absence of previous discussions around the lived experience of girls and young women from marginalised backgrounds has resulted in a fragmented understanding of how their lives are impacted by overlapping forms of disadvantage and discrimination. Children in the YGS space are overwhelmingly boys, and as a result, girls' needs and vulnerabilities can be overlooked. The experience of girls within the youth justice system, and particularly in custody, has been shown to compound existing vulnerabilities and add new ones. A lack of appropriate and adequate support for girls can diminish trust in institutions charged to protect and care for them and result in negative experiences and outcomes. The YJB is really committed to better understanding the specific challenges faced by girls in the youth justice space, and today we'll hear some really great insights from a range of speakers who we've got lined up, as well as shining a light on some practice examples. I'll pass back to you, Pippa. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. So I'm just going to talk you through how things are going to run today. So I am in a minute, I'm going to do some very brief context setting to really set the conversations that we're having today in context in a few different ways. Then in the first section, Rachel is going to be introducing Janine Davis and Ella Armstrong to talk about the insights from their work, both from a research perspective and from working directly with and drawing on the lived experiences of girls and young women in various different ways. Then there's going to be an opportunity for some audience Q&A, and then Rachel is going to be having a conversation with Chief Constable Catherine Roper, who is the National Lead for Children and Young People from the National Police Chiefs Council. Then there's also going to be some opportunity to ask questions of Chief Constable Roper at that point too. Then in the second section, I'm going to be introducing Abby Billinghurst from Abianda and Valerie Faulkner from Birmingham Youth Justice Service, and then having a conversation with Susanna Hancock, who is on the board of the YJB and crucially has recently led an independent review into girls in custody. There will be opportunities in that second section also for Q&A, and then we will wrap up and send you on your merry way for the rest of the day. So I'm just going to share some slides with you just to talk through a little bit of context setting for the day. So if I can figure out how to do that, then we'll be good to go. Okay, great. So firstly, Rachel's mentioned a couple of these already, but being as we've got so many people in the audience, we thought it would be helpful to set out some context and not assume any particular prior knowledge on anyone's part. So just very briefly, I thought it would be helpful to run through that the numbers of girls in the youth justice system are significantly low as compared to boys, but we know that the nature of their offending, their pathways into offending and their vulnerabilities are different and therefore require specific consideration, which is part of the rationale for this conversation today. We also know that girls are overlooked by research, by policy, and in some areas by practice. Girls' needs tend to be marginalised within a system that was primarily set up and designed to deal with offending behaviour by boys. And we also know that females receive differential treatment in court, where really important decisions are made about the trajectories of their lives in comparison to their male counterparts. Sometimes that means that they get harsher punishments, and sometimes it means that they are given a greater level of discretion, something which I'll come on to say a bit more about in a moment. And particularly girls in custody, we see a real concentration of those needs and see consistently that girls have frequently experienced various forms of abuse, exploitation, and a lack of care. There are really serious concerns about the experiences and treatment of girls, particularly in custody, around very high use of restraint, of force, which has demonstrated re-traumatization, feelings of lack of safety, and really significant issues with self-harm, which is why it's particularly important that Susanna is here today to have that custodial aspect of part of today's conversation. Now, often when we hear about girls in the youth justice system, it's part of a much wider success story in terms of youth justice in recent years. From around 2008, the number of children entering the youth justice system at all different stages has fallen really significantly, which is a brilliant credit to everybody that's been involved in that process. And that has actually happened, that reduction has happened at a much sharper rate for girls than it has for boys. So on the one hand, that's a really positive story to tell, but I just wanted to highlight, and this is some of my own research, which has looked back a little bit longer than that some of the longer term trends in the youth justice system for girls, and particularly girls in custody, do tell us a more cautionary tale. So from the 1990s to the mid-2000s, there was a period of a real increase in criminalisation and imprisonment of children overall, but those trends were particularly pronounced for girls. And since 2008, we've seen that sharp reversal of these trends, as I mentioned before. And I just wanted to show to you this graph, partly because it took me so long to put it together, going back using lots of data from different sources, but just to really demonstrate the trends here. And these trends are replicated in the youth justice system more widely. This goes back to 1992 up to the current day, and you can see there these huge trends. I was really struck when I was putting this together actually during 2020, how similar it looked to some of the COVID curves that we were used to looking at. And just to see that those huge changes in the youth justice system over the last few decades, and just to remind ourselves that the middle section of that graph, and in fact all of that graph, everything that's underneath that line represents the life of a girl or who is potentially now a young or not so young woman, and being involved in that graph will inherently mean that her life has taken a very different trajectory as a result of that and as a result of those different decisions. So at the peak, we had 530 girls in 2002 who were sentenced to custody. And in 2024, that was 19. So just, I really wanted to emphasize this to demonstrate what significant shifts in terms of public policy or not, as I'll come on to say, we've seen in this space. And just another graph there just to demonstrate that from that really low point in the numbers, I think that just really starkly demonstrates the fact that the change in the number of girls was much more significant than it was for boys. So we can see that there are really gendered consequences that are happening to girls in the youth justice system, which should send a kind of cautionary note to these conversations in terms of how we're contextualizing them. Another point to make, particularly having seen how significant some of those changes have been, I think it's really important for us to have this conversation on the understanding that actually throughout that period, there was no explicit policy objective which said that girls should be catapulted into the system at a greater rate than boys. Girls are actually consistently neglected in terms of explicit consideration in youth justice policy. So those dramatic changes that we've seen that have happened over time haven't come as a result of explicit policy objectives, which is why it's even more important for us to understand what's gone on there. And I should say that one of the exceptions to that is when I was doing my study and spoke to a range of different people from policy practice, those that have been involved in making decisions at the YJB and in government departments, it seems that the one thing that was consistently discussed was this problem of where to put girls in custody. And at some points in time, that's because there was too many of them. And today, that's because there's actually so few of them that causes a whole different set of dilemmas, which I know that Susanna will be talking to later on in the conversation. So we need to consider girls in the youth justice system in the wider context in terms of not what is just happening in terms of youth justice policy and practice, but how that's influenced by what else is going on. I'm not going to go into lots of detail about this, but this may bring back some memories for some of you, depending on where you're coming at this conversation. So what my research found was that during that period where there was a really significant increase in the number of girls coming into the system, that was actually really significantly impacted by what the public conversation was around girls at the time. And lots of those that I spoke to from both policy and practice consistently fed back that actually those changes weren't as a result of real changes in offending behaviour by girls during that period, but it was actually the way that that behaviour was viewed. And lots of that was really impacted by what was on the front of the tabloid newspapers, what was on TV, what was in kind of the public conversation around the time. So there was a real public concern that was generated around girls, which started to really infiltrate the way that they were responded to by different systems and services. Now, I mentioned earlier that from around 2008, we saw a really significant shift in what was happening in youth justice, which impacted boys as well as girls. But one of the things that came out really strongly from my study and the professionals that I spoke to was that for girls in particular, a significant part of the reason for that real shift in terms of the way that all of the different services are working with girls was a real shift in the way that we see girls' behaviour. So applying a different lens to their behaviour. So rather than being the girls on the front page of newspapers who are deemed to be ladettes, who are kind of violent, binge drinking thugs, all of a sudden those newspaper editors were in a position where they were reporting on a whole catalogue of terrible abuse scandals, which really centred the experiences of girls. So on the one hand, you've got a newspaper headline which is discussing violent girls who are kind of going out of control. And on the other hand, all of a sudden, those girls that were out at 2 o'clock in the morning, drunk with older men in the back of a taxi, all of a sudden we're starting to understand that actually that's not necessarily about their perpetration of offences, but that's actually about their vulnerability. So I think it's really important for the rest of the conversation for us to be really actively considering where are we now in terms of the way that we're discussing girls or not, as the case may be. So we know that in terms of these gendered dynamics within the youth justice system, that girls' behaviour that could be on the cusp of being seen as offending behaviour tends to be lower level, which means that the appetite that we have for diversion has a particular impact on girls. We know that the prevalence of their vulnerabilities means that the welfare and justice and safeguarding systems and the different ways that they respond to girls have a really important part to play, and that has changed over time. And there were also dynamics within those systems in terms of how those systems are responding to different groups of girls and how different, including racialized dynamics, come into those, which I know will be a topic of discussion later. And that girls are continually subject to gendered judgments that crucially we must consider in terms of intersectionality, so that the interconnectedness of those harms and adversities can be considered. So youth justice policies are prone to spiralling in unanticipated directions for girls, which really underlines the need for us to be actively considering them in youth justice policy, and the really important role that practitioners can play in terms of the way that they work with girls in order to guard against some of those potential issues. So that just leaves me to ask, where are we now in terms of all of these conversations? And that's why we've, in order to answer some of those questions, we have invited all of our brilliant speakers. So with that in mind, in terms of where we are in terms of history, where we are in terms of placing girls in youth justice in the wider context, I'm going to hand over to Rachel to continue those conversations with the first panel.
Thanks, Pippa. I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Janine Davis. Janine is a care experience professional with over 20 years of expertise. As director of Listen Up, an organisation amplifying the voices of marginalised children and advocating for change in safeguarding policy, practice and research, she is nationally recognised for her impact on adultification bias in child protection. Her PhD research is focused on safeguarding Black children. Janine serves as the Department for Education's National Kinship Care Ambassador and is an appointed member of the Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel, where she recently led the landmark review It's Silent, addressing race and racism in safeguarding children in England. Additionally, she sits on the Children and Young People's Scrutiny Commission. Welcome, Janine, and I'll hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and it's great to be here today. And as Pippa was speaking, I was like, oh my gosh, I need to add this in. Oh, I could have added this, because there was so much richness in what Pippa shared there. But what I'm going to do, with the hope of the slide pack, hoping it all works out, and it hopefully will be on your screen in a minute there. So what I've been tasked to do today is to really emphasize and focus on the phenomena which we know as adultification, because as the next presenters will go on to share some of their research and insights, I wanted to frame some of this within the context of, if we're going to talk about intersectionality, criminalisation, the pathologizing of girls, how racialization works, how vulnerability is decentered, how we have a hypervisibility of seeing when someone's doing something wrong, or perceptions of poor or bad behaviour, and that, as I said, removal and erasure of the inherent vulnerability all girls, all children have. To do that, we have to talk about adultification. So I'm starting with that framework to then assist with the wider conversations, which you'll all get to hear today. And I also think, when thinking about girls and youth justice, that's a part of a journey and experience, but we know that there would be various different agencies and interactions these girls would have navigated prior to experiencing that particular point in their life. So I do think it's important to look back and to think about how these various different biases inform the trajectory, the referral pathways, and ultimately the support or lack of support these girls experience or have the opportunity to access as well. I'm unapologetically very much in this presentation focused on the experiences of Black girls. That's the focus, particularly in relation to adultification, Black girls and white and Black children. However, there are transferable bits of learning which I hope will be useful for you. As Pippa touched on, I think when talking about any kind of gendered experience, it's difficult to talk about gendered experience without acknowledging the various different diverse ways in which that will look like, and who will experience those types of various forms of oppression. And that's because there is no universal experience, whether you're a girl or not. There are various mixed, diverse experience based on your intersecting identities. I'm not going to go via this, I'm not going to read word for word what's on this slide, but I'm hoping you'll see the arrows or the design on that image there, which shows that when thinking about the experiences of girls, you can't just think about, well, experiences of sexism over there, or racism over there, or classism over there, or ableism. Assumptions around what it is to be care, experience neurodiversity in a whole different box. We have to think about them as interrelated experiences which impact on how girls experience the world, how they're perceived, how they're responded to, how the world receives and responds to them, and therefore how that influences, again, how they navigate the world around them. And in order to understand adultification, we have to always understand that from an intersectional background. In 2020, my organisation developed the first definition, as we know, in the UK on adultification. And it was a wide-ranging definition to just acknowledge that ultimately this is an issue whereby notions of innocence and vulnerability are not afforded to certain groups of children, and that it's very much dictated by the ways in which institutions and people hold power over them. But we know that adultification occurs within the familial setting. Some will say parentification. Adultification is still the same issue. And we know, regardless of the various different contexts, based on literature and based on research, we see a familiar theme coming up, that regardless of the context in which it occurs, the impact ultimately results in the rights of children either being diminished or overlooked, because there is no child first concept when adultification is in place. Instead, the focus and the lens is very much on what it is, that what our assumptions are in terms of what we think those groups of children are doing. And adultification isn't necessarily new. There is lots of research which will continue to tell us. The first in 2019, which explicitly focused on girls, Black girls, in relation to child sexual abuse, which I conducted, relating to my master's in women and child abuse, where I asked that the research question was literally, where are the Black girls? Because as Pippa touched on, there was this real just erasure of the experiences of girls, but also for me an erasure of the experiences of Black girls in research, policy and practice. And I felt like I was constantly always doing a deep dive to try to understand what those experiences were, how they were understood. And what I looked at was the lens in which where the trope of being assumed to be hypersexual, aggressive, all of these various different stereotypes enforced on Black girls predating, and we know that links very much to enslavement, colonization, etc. But what I wanted to explore is the extent to which those various different beliefs and ideas influenced how professionals discharged their safeguarding duties, and adultification was very much a feature of that. We know in relation to missing people, again, this is one of the challenges we see in research where the intersectional framework isn't included, But in the missing report, when we've done a freedom of information request across police forces in England, missing people and ourselves, identified that Black children are more likely to go missing than any other group in terms of being overrepresented. But not only that, they're less likely to have a vulnerability indicator on their case, which means that when they go missing, in comparison to their white peers, they're less likely to have indicator on their case file saying this girl, for example, is missing or is at a greater risk of sexual exploitation, or we know that they may have mental ill health issues, etc. That information is missing. It's less likely to be included when you're a Black child. We know from the recent report from the panel, It's Silent, Race, Racism and Safeguarding, that we are still seeing across all of our safeguarding systems a difficulty in acknowledging, naming and questioning the extent to which racism and how it intersects with other forms of oppressions impact on our safeguarding duties. And I wanted to touch on this model because I feel when we're talking about adultification and those intersectional experiences, what this does is afford you an eye of curiosity to think about what does this then look like in relation to girls and how they will navigate not just the youth justice system, but all of the other systems in which they interact with. But in order to do that, again, you have to acknowledge intersectionality, to acknowledge the various different experiences they will encounter. But the preconditions of adultification undeniably are racism and discrimination. Yes, all children, all girls from all various different backgrounds can experience adultification, but let us not be fooled or let us not overlook who we know is most likely to be impacted by this harm. And if we're not questioning the various different stereotypes and tropes, beliefs, ideologies of girls, of how that's further impacted by racist tropes, if we're not using our curiosity and not thinking about how our organizations could be more courageous to lean on, whether it's discomfort, whatever it is, to question how policies or practices may further exacerbate the experiences girls experience, then you can see how that then frames their experiences. It leads to an erasure, a reduction of innocence. The inherent vulnerability of children very much experience becomes overlooked, and instead we see this increased level of responsibility and culpability leading to that erasure of children's rights. We see when it comes to the actual conditions, we see that if there is a level of inaction to promote and sustain learning, if we're only talking about anti-racist practice or practice around non-discriminatory behaviour as only a one-off kind of issue when we're being reactive to a serious case, a local child safeguarding practice review or particular learning, we can see how that may also delay some of our thinking and learning. We can see that actually where there is compassion fatigue and limited empathy and capacity within our systems, that can also impact on the moving away from child first approaches and delaying that curiosity to understand those gendered experiences. We can see if we're not thinking about neurodiversity and how trauma presents and only focusing on what we believe that behaviour is rather than questioning what that behaviour may be indicative of, we can see how girls can be framed in a context of blame and victim blaming, and therefore again enforcing this delayed safeguarding response where enforcement replaces safeguarding and protection. But as I speed through this, adultification, as I said, is on a continuum. You can't talk about adultification without acknowledging that it is a part of racism and continues as such. It doesn't just stop when a child is 18. We know that. We know it's a form of psychological harm. It's an act of dehumanization. It spans pre-birth and moves into the continuum into adulthood, where at that juncture, it just becomes normalized into the everyday experiences of racialized encounters. We know that, of course, it may differ depending on somebody's intersecting identity, gender, sexuality, disabilities. However, we also know that race and racism remain the central tenet in which this bias operates. And we know that when we talk about adultification, we can't say that vulnerability is just something which, of course, all children, all girls just experience. No, it's a privilege. Vulnerability is a privilege when adultification is present. We've seen it in these reports, which I'll touch on here, in some of the findings. The Double Discrimination Report Listen Up did on behalf of Barnardo's in 2023, Care Experienced Young Adults Experiences of the Criminal Justice System. And this girl said, well, the people in here claim that they want Black girls to win, yet when it comes to it, they just see me as the angry Black girl. In the Pushing Forward report on adultification, professionals are using the word, but they don't really understand the racialized experience, and there's this absence of removal of loving care. In the double discrimination report, when considering the stereotype of the angry Black woman, Dee and Amy agreed that due to racial bias, prison officers were less likely to believe and take the view that Black girls and women seriously. And interestingly, neither any of those young girls attributed their care status to the negative experiences in prison. For them, the differential treatment experience was primarily due to racial and their ethnic identity. But before I move on, because I know I have 10 minutes and I'm just nearing my final minutes, I wanted to ask you this question, because as I said, when we talk about adultification, we talk about invisibilization, we talk about how vulnerability isn't always provided, we talk about all of these various different factors we see exacerbating harm. But I want to ask all of you to just for a moment ask yourselves, when is this language ever, appropriate? This is a girl who when reviewing a local child safeguarding practice review, I supported, this was the language used to describe her, that she was dangerous, she was violent, she was aggressive, she had no remorse and showed no compassion. I want you to ask yourselves, what age do you think this girl was, child A, when this language was being used to describe her? Unfortunately, child A is currently in the youth justice system. She was 8 years old. Adultification is not something which just happens all of a sudden in adolescence. It's something, as I said, it's from pre-birth. It continues into early years. It continues into primary, secondary education, and it's on a trajectory. But I do think it's important to have hope and to hold on to hope. And you might not see this, and this is from my report, which says, where a practitioner says, I think considering the subject is new to many, I hope it will become, new to not so new to many, and many more of you will understand this. But some of us never heard of this term before, like only in the last few years. We're really trying. I feel hopeful, but we have to be in this for the long term. And that's the point. I think what Pippa's point and, the research which she highlighted tells us this can't just be something we do in the meantime, or is just something which, as I said, we become reactive to. We have to be have some sustainability in our approach, and we have to be willing to acknowledge that if we lose hope, then what does that mean for those girls who are constantly navigating systems which do not work for them, which exclude them, which do not flex for them, and which do not always understand them. But I want you to always go back to child A, who is now in this youth justice system, who at a young age, her experience, how she was identified, was always already determined, because as far as everyone was concerned, she was the issue rather than the systems and the experiences of harm she was experiencing at that time. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Janine. Lots of round of applause for you. Lots to reflect on, particularly around, that adultification and its impact, particularly on Black girls, and crucially as well, just going back to the start around that missing element. We're going to thank you. We are going to open up in around 10 minutes time for a Q&A session for Janine. We are going to hear from Ella now from Shift, but just to reassure those of you that have dialed into the webinar, we are going to have a Q&A in around 10 minutes time. But we now have Ella from Shift, who is the Learning and Insight Lead. Ella spent her career researching, designing, delivering and evaluating evidence-informed policies and interventions seeking to achieve better outcomes for children and families across criminal justice, education and mental health in the UK. Ella is passionate about amplifying and learning from the voices of often overlooked young people, families and communities, and combining these insights with those of practitioners and policymakers to drive meaningful systemic change. And without further ado, Ella, I will pass over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rachel. There are people around me from everywhere: police, social services, and people who care. I tell them all to leave me alone, but deep down inside, alone is what I am afraid of most. I push people away to protect myself from being let down. Social workers change hands like a merry-go-round. In fact, that's more like it from what I can see. A circus of professionals, none of whom know me. It only took one social worker to see past my pain, to sit with me always and never complain. The always is what helped me survive, to get through the days when I didn't want to be alive. That poem is a written contribution from a 17-year-old girl with lived experience of exploitation and criminalisation to our most recent report, Invisibilised, Girls Caught Up in or at Risk of Crime. My name's Ella Armstrong and I'm the Learning and Insight Lead at Shift, which is a national systems change organisation rooted in anti-racist, anti-oppressive and systemic practice. We work with children and families caught up in or at risk of crime. Our Shift practitioners, who are called Shift Guides, they work intensively and persistently over 18 months with a small group of children across youth justice, social care, education, the police, courts, custody and health. It's a real privilege to be invited to speak here today, and I want to really begin by acknowledging the work that many of you have been doing to improve the experiences of girls in these systems. There's certainly been a renewed focus in recent months, and I think a real growing momentum around recognising and responding more meaningfully to girls' needs. And the report I'm drawing on today really builds on that momentum. It's shaped by the voices of girls, it's shaped by their families and the professionals working with them. And it's brilliant to have the opportunity to amplify their experiences and also their vision for change with so many of you here. One of the clearest themes that emerged from the research was the need for a more relational, contextualized understanding of girls' experiences, which I know has been mentioned already today. Too often, girls are criminalized for behaviors that are trauma responses. For example, girls who challenge authority, maybe they push people away, or maybe they show their distress through anger or withdrawal. They're often seen as difficult rather than vulnerable. They're seen through a lens of disruption rather than distress. And as Janine spoke about, this is particularly true for Black girls. It's also true for those in care who face compounded disadvantage due to the intersecting factors which drive higher rates of arrest and criminalisation. 52% of girls in custody have been in care, or that was true when there were girls in custody, and 75% of the girls Shift works with were open to children's social care when they were referred. Girls are often carrying these overlapping vulnerabilities, but too often the response is fragmented and not tailored to specific and holistic needs. One viewed as part of the research described how her daughter, one of only 2 girls at her pupil referral unit, was treated by staff when things began to go wrong. The first thing that went wrong with Lucy, that was it. Then she would be penalised for that without looking at the bigger picture. She got the brunt of everything, literally, even if it wasn't her. We know that girls' needs and experiences don't fall neatly into one department, and yet our services often do. Social care, education, youth justice, and mental health services frequently operate in silos, and without better join up, I think we really risk missing the bigger picture and instead locating the problem within the girls themselves. Without this nuanced and kind of holistic understanding of girls' lived realities, we really risk exacerbating harm, negative stereotypes, and increasing criminalisation rather than providing meaningful support. While we know that 81% of girls with an Asset Plus assessment have mental health concerns, access to mental health services remains really inconsistent. CAN's Tier 4 bed days have halved since 2020, and that's especially relevant for girls, as we know so often they internalise distress and that manifests itself as mental health issues. Now, I really welcome the brilliant changes that have been made regarding how we respond to and support girls in contact with the youth justice system. The closure of young offender institution places for girls is a really important step forward, given all that we know about the trauma that is caused for children in custody, and we really welcome this at Shift. But these girls haven't disappeared. Without working in a multi-agency way across the different systems that I previously mentioned to create viable and effective community-based alternatives, I think we risk displacing the issue to another part of the system and continuing the invisibilisation of girls and creating unintended consequences, including maybe in unregulated placements or in deprivation of liberty orders. There's been a 277% rise in the number of children placed in unregistered placements in England between 2020 and 2023. At Shift, we take a practice-led approach to this systems change that needs to happen. We support professionals to build consistent and trusting relationships with girls, relationships that allow time and presence and context. But we know that for many professionals, that kind of work is really difficult to sustain in systems that are so risk averse, so under pressure, and not always designed for multi-agency collaboration. Many of the practitioners that I spoke to in the research shared that they didn't always feel equipped to work well with girls, not because they didn't care, far from it, in fact, but because they lacked the tools or time or support to do so effectively. And what I think that highlighted is the need for ongoing training, reflective spaces, and leadership that really values trauma-informed and gender-sensitive work. I think professionals need to be supported to work with curiosity, compassion, and confidence, even when things feel complex or uncertain. For example, one of the girls, Dreams, who's 19, said, they're more physically there than the other workers that I've had in the past that weren't Shift. They wouldn't be going the extra mile, which is what I really liked about Shift. At Shift, the systemic practice is at the heart of everything that we do, and we've developed tools to help our guides think systemically before they even meet the child for the first time. However, as I said, I really know that this isn't a luxury that many professionals can afford to have, as I know you're under constant pressure to respond quickly and meet targets. So my call to action for the policymakers and system reformers in the room is to think about how our infrastructure and institutions are getting in the way of practitioners having the opportunity to do this work really well on the ground. We've seen really positive developments recently, including the independent review into girls in custody, which made some really important recommendations that require urgent follow-up. But we need to make sure that those changes don't sit in isolation. We've got different strands of government, for example, violence against women and girls and the Safer Streets mission, without a recognition that many of those issues are interlinked and I think are struggling to work interdepartmentally at the moment. Solutions are being developed separately, even though they relate to the same children. For example, one of the girls that, or many of the girls, in fact, that I spoke to had mothers with experience of the criminal justice system, and they described how intergenerational patterns of harm are repeated. For example, Lucy described, she said, I felt singled out, to be honest, because they knew some of my family who had not done good. A bit. I think it would be so helpful if girls were included on the Women's Justice Board rather than creating another board for girls. Let's do what we can to stop kind of dividing the issues that are clearly so connected. The girls I spoke to, they want to be heard. They want to help shape the services they interact with, and they want professionals to see them not as cases, but as people with histories, hopes, and strengths. So as we continue this really important work and continue making strides in this space, let's commit to doing it with girls and not to them. Let's think relationally, let's practice ensure that girls' voices are centred in this process. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ella. A real pertinent point for me to see children and families as that, not just cases or ID numbers, as sometimes they're referred. We have opened the Q&A function on the call, so if anybody's got any questions for Ella or Janine on anything that they've heard or any comments, then please use the Q&A function. Lots to reflect on, lots to think about. I don't know whether any of our fellow speakers on the webinar have got any questions they'd like to, or my wonderful co-host Pippa, if you've got any questions.
Yeah, I've got a quick question actually for Ella on the back of her presentation, if that's okay. I think you mentioned, Ella, around the importance of different systems working together and what the implications are for multi-agency working. So I just wondered if you could say a bit about what you think that should look like in practice when supporting girls, and how we can move beyond kind of tokenism around multi-agency working for girls and embed it a bit more consistently.
Yeah, thank you, Pippa. That's a really good question. I think especially for girls, particularly those in care or those with overlapping needs. You know, that multi-agency working can be the difference between being understood in a context or being kind of repeatedly misread or let down, maybe. In practice, what we've seen at Shift making a difference is, you know, when professionals don't just work in parallel, but they actively collaborate around a shared plan with the girl at the centre, and not just kind of as the subject of that plan, but the plan kind of includes their needs, their insights, their preferences as part of it. For example, at the moment, we're working really closely with the police to ensure that every child that's supported by Shift has a one-page document which is attached to their case file on the police database. So if that child is, you know, picked up by the police, then the officer is aware of that child's social graces, why they might be presenting in a certain way, you know, what that officer might need to be aware of when interacting with that child. I think the same could be done with schools as well. So that's just one thing that we're doing. And I appreciate that, you know, like the time and flexibility that Shift guides are afforded means that they can walk alongside that girl at every point in their life through every aspect, and really hold that relational thread with other professionals and pull different people in at the right time. I think for other professionals that are trying to do similar work, but aren't necessarily graced with that time and flexibility, that requires change at a system level, as I mentioned, to do that work properly and not tokenistically. So, you know, things around time and permission for practitioners to build those relationships across different agencies. That requires brave leadership, I think, that values and resources this work, even when it might be slower or harder to evidence potentially. And then I think that will where we maybe stop expecting girls to navigate these systems and processes, and instead support them in kind of filling the gap that they sometimes come across, and help to do a bit of that join up work, and holding systems accountable for that.
Thanks, Ella. We've had a bit of a comment in the Q&A function from Stephanie, just saying that she found the poem that you read out at the start really powerful, and she was wondering whether you'd be willing to share it. But if memory serves me right, Ella, and you're going to correct me, I think that's in your report, invisibilised at the start, isn't it? Which we can share links to for everybody that's joined us today. But you tell me if I'm wrong, Ella.
No, you're quite right. That was just an extract from the poem. The full one is in the Invisibilised report.
So we will share that afterwards. And we've had another question, another couple of questions saying, do you have something I can give to Somerset Police when dealing with girls when dysregulated to assist, as often officers end up being assaulted by these deregulated girls? We are seeing a huge increase in this when officers need educating on how to respond to traumatised girls. Maybe that's something we'll come on to with the chat with Catherine Roper. Any questions for Janine on her section on adultification? I can't see anybody, but if anybody's asked one and it's not come through, then please just raise your hand and we can come to you. I'm going to take two questions in order, and then if people can put them in the... Well, Councillor Victoria Aitken, you've got a question.
Hi everybody. Hi. Yeah. So it's really powerful, really great stuff. Thank you very much indeed. And what I was asking was, there's a lot in here that's about language and how we represent the young people and how that representation is impacting on that child's life. And I take that as really powerful and really, really important. And every member on here and everybody that is dealing with, whether they're police or local authority or health or whoever they are, that are dealing with these kids, that are working alongside them, are also community members. They're also members of our wider community. And I'd like us to be thinking, and I'm raising this here as a national conversation, really, to actually get that national conversation of what language is correct, how we should be using the words that we spout out just willy-nilly without thinking about. And I think that if we can actually change that and help our wider population by turning the whole conversation into a much more, I'm going to use the word friendly. I'm not a professional, I'm a counsellor. So, but you know, that into that real world language, rather than I've been in children's services now 4 years. So a lot of what you have said, I understand and get, but I've been in children's services 4 years. So a lot of the terminology is really, really, you know, at a high level of understanding, as opposed to just normal people's conversation. And I think we blind people with science, and I think we've got to make it much more accessible. That's my soapbox. I say it about a lot of the things that I deal with. So, okay. Thanks, Rachel.
You. Thank you very much, Councillor.
Can I just say something to that about language?
Yes.
Well, first, I'll give my plug to please read, if you haven't already, the Pushing Forward report, which is attesting the learning of the last 5 years since the first ever learning and development session on adultification in this country, and looking at how language has shifted or changed across our various different agencies and systems. And that was speaking to 46 practitioners across the country, hearing them share their various different reflections. But I think sometimes we make this more difficult than we need to. I always just go back to, you know, how would you like to be described? I think about just if we go back to a kind of humanistic, relational, response, just back to basics. If a person was standing in front of me, would I describe them as being, you know, aggressive or angry? I might find different language to use. There's something about how do we justify the language we use when we're writing that in case notes and reports, and would we use that same language if that person was in front of us? If not, why not? What's the impact? The context in which we use language impacts on the consequence, impacts on the referral pathways, the trajectory of that child. I think back to myself being a care experienced child in the system, and at 25, choosing to review my access my report. There was no one to go back to. There was no one to say, I wasn't angry. I didn't have a chip on my shoulder. I was experiencing harm. I was really sad. I didn't know that, you know, how to show my various different emotions. For many children, many girls, when you're framing them in a particular way, particularly when you're, you know, such a kind of negative and deficit tone, there is no one to go back to erase. Instead, what we have is this kind of pathway to another agency who's then reviewing and viewing this child if they're not having that curiosity, or applying those questions and just informing, you know, forming their decisions and their beliefs, etc., based on the language we have used. So I don't think it needs to be so difficult. I think it's basic. I think it's about respect. I think it's about transparency and about how we would like to be treated. And it always goes back to that saying, whether you have children or not, or loved ones, is it good enough for mine? If it's not, then why would it be good enough for somebody else's?
Thank you, Janine. We've got 2 more questions. Mandy, I'm going to come to you just for a question. Can you please let us know which panel member it's for, whether it's for Ella or Janine? You are still on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, I was muted. It's for Janine. Hi, Janine. It was a really good talk. Thank you. My question was, am I right in thinking that you said that this little 8-year-old girl is now in the youth justice system? Like, I'm confused because the age of criminal responsibility is 10. So how can we have an 8-year-old in a system when she can't be criminalised?
So well, she definitely can be criminalised, maybe just not in that legal framework. But in terms of this particular case, she's not 8 now. At 8 years old, when we done a review, looking back of how she was treated or how professionals were considering the various different harm she was experiencing at that time, we could see that this language was being used to describe her when she was in primary education. She is now a teenager in the youth justice system. So that to answer that question, but what we identify, because sometimes when we talk about adultification, there is a tendency to only talk about it in the context of adolescence and not necessarily thinking about it in terms of younger children. And the whole point of adultification is, regardless of your age, there is a way in which various different beliefs, the ways in which we think or talk about children, impacts on you regardless of whether you're 8 or whether you're 16. But that was just given an example that from a young age, using this, where people might have said 15, 16 is what I tend to hear. We don't necessarily think about, actually, no, this was an 8-year-old. So if we're talking about 8-year-olds and using this language, it really begs the question as to what else might be happening or is happening across our various different systems.
Yeah, absolutely crazy. Thank you.
Thanks, Janine, for answering, and thanks. We are just going to cut short there the Q&A. Just, I'm aware that there's 2 of you that have got your hand up. If you can use the Q&A function. As always, there's some technicalities, and then there's some technical difficulties, and this is all new. So we're getting to grips with the Q&A function, and hopefully it should work now. But just a huge thank you to Ella and Janine. You've been absolutely fantastic. And I'm sure as the last hour goes on, we're going to have lots more questions for you. But please use the Q&A function, and we can always come back to those and answer them at a later date or separately. But I am keen that the rest of our panelists get adequate time to speak about some other really great issues that are going on across the youth justice space and for girls in particular. So we are going to move on to in conversation with myself and Catherine Roper, I think. Hopefully Catherine is on the call now and she has joined us.
I am, absolutely. Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Welcome. It's lovely to have you with us. Just for those colleagues on the call, Catherine, you are the Chief Constable for Wiltshire Police and have done that role since February 2023. You've got an extensive background that I'm in awe of. You've Cardiff University graduate with an LLB in law and politics. You joined the Metropolitan Police in 2000, initially working frontline policing in South London before qualifying as a detective. You've spanned many areas of policing, including specialist crime, armed unit, custody, intelligence, protection, professional standards and crime prevention. And you were the first female borough commander for Islington and led one of the 2 pilot borough merges combining Camden and Islington and borough command units. Quite the CV, but as well as that, you hold the National Police Chiefs Council Children and Young People portfolio and is post-incident manager for firearms incidents, as well as previously being a strategic firearms commander. You've got 2 master's qualifications. You're a member of the Forward Institute, a fellow of the Westminster Abbey Institute, and a graduate of the US International Visitor Leadership Programme. And in your spare time, how you have any spare time, I have no idea. You are the Assistant District Commissioner for the Girl Guides, having launched the National Girl Guide Police Challenge Badge in 2019. What an amazing career you've have. Just talk us through what you're doing now, what you're currently doing, and what's your interest in girls in the youth justice space.
Thank you. So first of all, it's an absolute honour to be here and to listen to the previous speakers. Thank you so much indeed. And I have lots and lots of conversations that I hope you don't mind us having outside of here. And I wasn't expecting to be given a bit of a CV rundown as well. So thank you very much indeed for that. But coming back to your questions, to me, policing is an absolute privilege, and I've always been in policing my entire career, and I have worked a lot with young people, as you say, within my career and outside in my private life, particularly within girl guiding, and also some other volunteering. And as you say, I am the National Police Chiefs Council lead for children and young people, and through that, I get the ability to influence all of policing across England and Wales in terms of how we approach children and young people, but particularly, of course, this discussion today is the lens with regards to how we support young females in the criminal justice system, or ideally, frankly, to keep them out of the criminal justice system. So when I was preparing for today, you very kindly sent me some potential questions that we might talk through. And I very much looked at, okay, well, what is it that policing is doing for children and young people generally? What is it policing is particularly doing for women and girls, but particularly girls from today? And I think I should start by reassuring everybody that I don't think that policing is doing enough. So please don't think that anything I say in this conversation is to suggest that policing is doing enough. What I think is that policing is doing more, but it's certainly not doing enough. And the reason I say that is because sometimes policing can come across as if, no, we've actually got this sorted, but we haven't, have we? We've just heard terrible experiences of young girls in the criminal justice system who are being treated as if they have experiences or knowledge or decision making far beyond that which is their capability to do. We have heard experiences of girls who are not being respected and being treated empathetically for their terrible experiences as well. So whilst I think that policing has improved, I don't want anybody to think that policing is absolutely that we finished our learning, and I really want to hear from everybody today about what more we can do. So hopefully, Rachel, you don't mind me starting from that perspective.
That's brilliant, thank you.
No, and I truly mean it. Again, I just sort of put this out there that with my national portfolio hat on, we do have regular meetings every quarter from a national perspective, and I invite any and everybody to join those meetings because you have direct access to both the policing community, but also many others. And of course, the YJB sits on that and other meetings that I have. So again, if anybody would ever want to join that, then open invitation to help us learn. So Rachel, coming back to your point, so I've had a look at where we are, particularly treating on females, and I think that we have seen some progress in the criminal justice system. And I think it's important to remember that it is a system. There's that initial point where a female, a girl, will be making decisions. They'll be vulnerable. They might have been for reasons totally that they are victim of. They might have been pushed, they're marginalised in some of our traditional institutions, say at the education institutions. They might not have a particularly supportive network around them. Their home network might not be good. Their familial network might not be good, which of course makes them incredibly vulnerable. And I think if we look at some of the patterns of girls in the criminal justice system, we see that it is often, I think, linked to where they have been exploited, where they've been exploited criminally or where they've been exploited from a child sexual abuse perspective. And I think that then they come into contact with policing, which is often their first moment, isn't it, of contact, be it through stop and search. And we see less female stop and search than we do boys. But at the same time, there is still that contact there. There might be that engagement there. There might be that general engagement in terms of youth engagement that policing are involved with, but often those moments of friction might be stop and search, might be a police officer or a police representative of PCSO perhaps going and speaking to a group of young people, maybe in a park or something, and then there might be something that someone might be reported as doing something, and then the moments of contact become with more friction and with more moments of frankly it deteriorating, and those moments of trust deteriorating. We then have situations where a girl might be stop and searched, or they might be arrested, they're then taken into the custody system. There's that moment of custody, and we've just talked about that a little bit. But do I think that the custody process is truly empathetic towards girls particularly? No. But I also don't think that the custody process is truly empathetic towards children and young people. So, and I'm trying to focus on our topic today in terms of girls in the youth justice system. But I do believe that there is more that policing and the youth justice system can do for children and young people more generally. And then there's moments of what happens to a girl if they're retained in the criminal justice system. Where are they placed? We talked about some of the progress that's recently been made, certainly with the recommendations in terms of girls not being placed in youth offending institutions anymore, but that's quite far down, isn't it, into the youth justice system. And so I think that every single touch point, policing and the youth justice system needs to become much more empathetic to children and young people more generally, but particularly to girls, and recognising the particular vulnerabilities that come for girls, particularly if they are made more vulnerable or if they're being exploited. Now, Rachel, I'm conscious that I could chat a lot, and we're meant to be in conversation. So is there anything you particularly, I can carry on, but hopefully you can hear from I can talk about what I'm doing specifically from the Children and Young Persons portfolio. I can talk a little bit from my experiences with Wiltshire. But is there anything particularly you wanted me to address whilst you and I are in conversation, which I appear to be dominating?
It's absolutely fine. It's very clear that you're very passionate, and that's definitely coming across. I think one of my questions that I had, and we have opened up the chat function, I hope you don't mind, just to see if any of our audience have got any questions. But in your experience, do girls come into contact with the justice system for different reasons than boys? Is there any common themes that you see in your experience? Do you know, is that something? Are they different issues? Are they the same? What's
So
that like?
yeah, sure. So from the data shows that girls tend to come into, as I say, stop and search less than boys, but they tend to come into contact with the youth justice system more for things like shoplifting, maybe alcohol, maybe a bit of antisocial behaviour, and quite frankly, I think concerns that should recognise that they're probably vulnerable for something. And particularly if you look at just how our improved understanding with regards to exploitation, both criminal and sexual, our improved understanding with how that looks now, which I think, reflecting on some of the comments of the previous speakers, we didn't understand as well 10, 20 years ago, did we? But I think we now do understand it. So girls tend to come into contact from a slightly different perspective, which is probably why, to be honest, they're not stop and search as much, because actually stop and search tends to link to violence, to knives, to drugs. Girls don't tend to be reported for that. They tend to be recognised for other types of behaviours. But of course, if you look at those types of behaviours, as I say, that tends to reflect some kind of disassociation with something perhaps a bit more traditional. So particularly if you look at coming out of COVID is a really good moment in time for us to understand where children, young people across the board, but particularly girls, some of them found it really difficult to reintegrate themselves with the with education, with youth clubs, with youth groups, because they were out for so long, which actually meant that they were much, much more vulnerable to associating themselves with people that are not recognizing the vulnerability that's right around them. And so then they become the victims of something and other behaviors. And then they'll come into contact with policing or the youth justice system from that respect. I can't see the chat function. I can't see the Q&A function. So are there any Q&As that anybody's put in, or did you want me to carry on talking a bit more about?
Nobody's put anything in the chat, but I think we're having a little, as you can imagine, there always is some technical difficulties, but I've just seen one come in from Lauren. Lauren's just asked, with the label of vulnerability, is there any reason, except for the systemic issues raised, that they wouldn't be vulnerable, as in, are not all children engaging in crime by definition vulnerable?
They absolutely are. I do believe that they are. And I think that that's where policing has got to really improve its understanding. So from a national portfolio perspective, we launched the new strategy last year in terms of how we really wanted to move policing forward to become truly, truly child-centred. And we're very shortly about to launch a charter which will look at in-year progress, so we can absolutely track through the progress that we can make from a policing perspective. I'm going to come back to the partnership element in a minute, though, if I may, Rachel, because policing cannot do this alone. But some of the conversations that I'm having with the College of Policing is, okay, so where is it in our policing that we are explicit around the fact that children are children? We learn lots of policies and processes and procedures, but where is it? And it is a golden thread that very too quietly runs through all of policing training. Absolutely, policing training recognises children, it recognises ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, it recognises the impact that can have. But my view is it needs to become much more explicit and much more blatant in terms of the training for policing, because then I believe, coming back to the question, that actually when a police officer or a member of police staff or anyone within the criminal justice system is dealing with a child, they recognise that, of course, there is an inherent vulnerability when a child is a child, and they can approach it from a different perspective. Now, sometimes, as we all know, a policing moment, a policing event, a policing incident can be incredibly, incredibly challenging. But if we can approach it from the fact that we're dealing with somebody and trying to respond to somebody who is probably trying to process a huge amount of personal challenge, personal injury, for metaphorically, I mean, not necessarily physically, then hopefully we can try and understand why someone might be behaving in the way that they are in front of us. And the two previous speakers spoke a lot about that, and I fundamentally agree with it. But that's part of the work that I'm doing with the College of Policing at the moment, which is where are we, and where are we really sort of highlighting it. There's lots of things that we do about out-of-court resolutions in policing, and I think that we recognise the value of deferred prosecutions, of finding ways that we can prevent, hopefully, people coming into the criminal justice system at all with intervention. And all police forces and all policing services look at ways that we can engage with children and young people, and particularly girls. You spoke about my work with guiding, and we're now to try and change that relationship and try and build trust and confidence, particularly with guiding, because it's girls who need to build up that trust. But what I would say is with guiding, you're generally dealing with girls who are really happy to be part of an institution and who are really happy and have that ability to trust and engage. And so, of course, we need to really focus on those people who, those children who find it much harder, and particularly, of course, in this circumstance, girls in the justice system. So hopefully that answers that question, but hopefully it also shows that I'm trying to track it through. One of the areas that I think that policing has made significant progress, but again, I never think we've made enough, is in the area of recognising women and girls as victims. We talk about the WARG agenda. We talk about recognising the impact of criminality on violence against women and girls. There's somebody who's not on mute, and there we go. Sorry, it sounded to me a little bit like nails across a chalkboard, and it was beginning to become a bit distracting. So I'm so sorry, anyone that's not on mute. But I do think that we have recognised the specific vulnerability with regards to women and girls, and the needs to make sure that we're really considered and thoughtful and caring to try and create that moment where someone is a victim of crime as supportive as possible. And even then, I don't think that we've got that entirely right, but I think we've got better. And I think that there's been a huge amount of coverage, and certainly successive governments have really identified that need to focus on violence against women and girls, and that issue and that added complication when there is a child victim. But I do think that we need to do much, much more in recognising that experience of the child, how all of those societal challenges, perhaps disadvantage, unfairness, it's from so many different lenses, how that can impact on the child that is having that moment of contact with the criminal justice system and with policing, and how we can respond to that better as policing, because we're the adults and we have to take the responsibility of making sure that we respond as well as we possibly can to that instance. And I always think there's more that we can do.
Completely agree. We've got lots and lots of questions in the chat for you, and I know that you you can't. I'm going to just pick out a couple, if that's all right. We've had a question around an issue in a particular area, Derbyshire, where young girls are being charged with assault against police officers. And Michael's asking, is there anything that can be done to reduce these offences? And I'm thinking that might be something that's affecting quite a lot of youth justice services nationally. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
So I think that to be able to answer that truly, I'd need to understand a little bit more what's happening in that particular area, and also the situations that's happened. So every single force is represented on my National Children and Young Persons portfolio, and so these are some questions that I'm very, very happy to take back and seeing, well, actually, what's happening particularly there? What's happening across the board in terms of, are we seeing an increased pattern, and what ages, what circumstances, what are the surrounding situations? We know, because tragically crime patterns are showing us, that we're beginning to see police come into contact with more girls actually when they have been abused, when they have been exploited, when they have been criminalized because of who they're with. And often that links to alcohol, but they're victims. Ultimately, they are victims, these girls that are coming into contact with police in those circumstances. So I wouldn't like to comment on a particular policing area, but these issues, if I can have a copy of the chat bar, which I still can't see, then I can definitely bring it up and I can take it back and I can make sure that I talk to my policing colleagues.
We will absolutely, just to reassure those that have joined us on the webinar, that if you have asked a question in the chat and it's not been raised live with us today, we will copy these into a bit of an email, Catherine, and send them over to you, and you can have a look at them at a later date. I'm sure colleagues on the call will be really grateful for that. I'm going to take one last question from the chat before our conversation sadly comes to an end for this webinar. Anyway, I'm sure our conversation will long continue, but somebody's asked a question on what are your thoughts on how we widen contextual safeguarding beyond the voluntary community sector to become standard practice with other agencies, including yourselves as the police and the youth justice system?
Thank you. So I did say that I'd come back to partnership, and so thank you for that question, because that's a nice segue in. And so I would be surprised if any agency involved in the criminal justice system considers them to have anything other than safeguarding at the heart of what they do. I'm not saying that's the outcome we're seeing. So again, please, but I don't think there is any agency within the criminal justice system or with any kind of safeguarding system. So for example, with policing, if they come in, if you know, someone from Wiltshire Police, or as you say, I was in the Met before, if they come into contact with a child, there are various policies and processes to make sure that we put them into a multi-agency safeguarding hub, which means that we collaboratively and collectively work together to make sure that we can look after that child as well as we possibly can, accepting that we are hearing evidence of failure. So again, as I say, I'm not saying it's a I'm not suggesting it's working across the board. So I believe that the safeguarding partnerships believe it is mainstreamed, which I think, because I can't see the wording of the question, but I think that's the theme. I think what we're hearing is that that is not the experience of the child. And one of the questions, Rachel, that you asked me to think about beforehand was, if I could change anything at all within the criminal justice system, what would it be? And I really thought long and hard, because there's lots of small bits that I would love to change. And policing, in terms of being truly child-centered, was one of them. But one of the bits I think I'd like to change is that consistency point, because I think that we let down children because of a lack of consistency. We've already talked about people not having consistent support, not having consistent engagement, not having the consistent support worker, not having the consistent sort of diversion support. And I think that's why we fail children. And I think that's why that we fail children and young people, because we're not providing that consistency. And I would put that across the entire criminal justice process. If I may, and then I'll stop talking, I promise, is I just wanted to pick up a little bit on that issue of adultification. So we within policing are improving our understanding and our response to adultification. But again, my view is that we have a lot further to go. And it was just to reassure the people on this call that I'm working with one of the other chief officer leads who's looking at stop and search, and we are looking at collaboratively really challenging ourselves about the issue of adultification, particularly at that moment of stop and search. But of course, then that will promulgate in terms of learning much more broadly. So I did mention it to colleagues who've already spoken on the call. I'll probably be talking to them, if it's okay, outside of here, because I think policing has a lot to learn. And if people are prepared to help us, then I'll be really, really grateful. But Rachel, I will stop talking again. Sorry.
Thank you so much. I'm sure we could spend another hour chatting and asking each other questions and reflecting on what works really well and what doesn't. But we have got a little agenda that we need to keep to. But Catherine, you've been phenomenal. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for inviting me. I really am humbled. Thank you.
Your insights have been so useful, and I assure you that we'll get some of those questions from the Q&A function, and I'll drop you an email with some of them in, so you can have some time to reflect. But really great reflections, and really admire your honesty and your authenticity in this subject area. It's really, really great, and your passion has definitely shone through. But without further ado, I am going to close that conversation. Thank you very much. And
thank you very much.
No problem. I'll hand over to you, Pippa. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rachel. Well, I am here to introduce Abby. So if we can get Abby up on the screen too, that would be brilliant. It's my pleasure to welcome Abby to talk to us today. It's Abby Billinghurst, who is the founder and CEO of an organisation called Abianda, who is very close to my heart, having served previously on their board of trustees. Abby is the founder and CEO of Abianda. For anyone that doesn't know about Abianda, where have you been? They are a pioneering London-based organisation who supports girls and young women affected by criminal exploitation and violence. Since founding Abianda in 2011, Abby's led the organisation's growth and mission to transform how services are delivered to girls and young women. She brings over 20 years of experience of working with and managing services for vulnerable young people across the violence against women and girls, youth and criminal justice sectors. Abby's also a very busy woman, much like many of our speakers. So in addition to leading Abianda, she's a visiting lecturer at several universities where she shares her expertise in working directly with girls and young women, and contributes to various pieces of academic research on the experiences of young people. Abianda was founded on the principle of working shoulder to shoulder with young women and girls to amplify their voices and increase their ability to influence decisions that impact their lives. So it's with great pleasure that I pass over to Abby to tell you a bit more about the brilliant work that they do. So over to you, Abby.
Hi everyone, thanks Pippa for that lovely introduction. Can I just check you can see my PowerPoint on the screen? Is that okay?
We can.
You can. Wonderful. Hello, good afternoon. It's really, really lovely to be here. And Rachel and Pippa and the NCB and YJB, thank you for convening so many people. It's amazing. What a great turnout around such an important issue, which, yes, as Pippa has talked about, I've spent about 24 years of my career as a youth worker predominantly, but really grappling with actually what works when it comes to delivering services for girls and young women. I have got far too many slides for the time that I've got to talk, so I am going to rattle through. I apologise. I'm really happy to pick up conversations outside of this event. I'm going to give you a little bit about who we are and what we've been doing for the past 11 years. I'm going to focus on who are the girls we're working with, but also why aren't they showing up? And we've heard a lot of those messages, particularly from Ella as well, from her great work that she's been doing at Shift. And then a little bit about what we try and do about it at Abianda and what sort of defines our practice and our approach. I think it's really important to say, whilst this conversation is about broader criminal justice experiences of girls and young women, our focus is very deliberately so on girls' experiences of criminal exploitation and violence. So it's from that angle that I'm bringing something which I hope will be useful for the conversation today. So we, as Pippa has very sort of generously introduced us, we're a London-based charity. I set the organisation up 11 years ago, having been a youth worker and seeing the problem that girls was just not considered when it came to issues of gangs and county lines, which is what our kind of primary focus was when I started up the organisation. And that wasn't good enough for me. It wasn't good enough that girls didn't feel safe to come forward and access services. And it wasn't good enough that sort of back in 2007, when I was sort of thinking about what can I do about these issues, that local authorities, when asked what they do with girls coming to them with experiences of gang association, were saying they also didn't know what they would do with those girls and young women. And while so much great work has happened since then, I think actually the reasons I set the organisation up in terms of young women's invisibility still stands, and we're seeing that in all the evidence that's being spoken about here today. So now we describe our work as more appropriately so, because it moves away from often the kind of the racist and classist kind of discourse around gangs, but it more accurately talks about girls being affected by criminal exploitation and violence. And we are interested in working with girls and young women to really support their independence and agency in the context of that extrafamilial harm. I'll talk a bit more about that. Why aren't we trying to increase safety? I'll try and get to that a little bit later on. But we have a range of activities, from direct services for girls and young women, one-to-one work, group work. We've been delivering training across the country for 11 years about effective working with girls and young women around these issues, and really trying to bring about practice and systems change so that their needs are understood and supported more effectively. And yes, as Pippa said, we were really founded on the basis of working shoulder to shoulder with young women, and we're growing a network of girls and young women in order that we can get into policy and influencing spaces. Just a note on our founding principles, because whilst the language has evolved, and obviously our organisational design and development, my dog has now just started barking really annoyingly, it's typical, our principles haven't, and we are fiercely loyal to these founding principles. Really importantly, a fundamental belief in young women's competence, and that they must be partners in the change and safeguarding process, but also that the expertise of their own lives is valued. No one walks in that young woman's shoes or knows her life like she does. And if we're to create services that fit with the reality of young women's lives, we must value and centralise the expertise of her own life. And particularly so in safeguarding processes, where if we don't, and if we're not working in partnership with her, arguably we set her up to fail. Okay, who are the young women? I mean, in short, some of the most incredible people I've ever met, quite frankly, are vibrant, entrepreneurial, hilarious, are independent, are disruptors, resistors, and they are survivors. And they survive adversity like I have never seen. This is a slide that we created with young women some time ago. So while some of the language may have evolved, what this represents is the breadth of experience of young women have across criminal exploitation and violence that might typically be associated with gangs and county line activity. And this is really important because often what we see is young women show up in our systems and processes in regard to experiences of sexual exploitation, as Catherine was sort of alluding to earlier. But what can get missed sometimes is all the vast experiences that they might have, or different ways that they might be involved, and where harm and abuse is experienced. So it's important that we don't have a blinkered and siloed sort of view when we're looking at young women's experiences around the issues that we're working around as an organisation. We've heard a lot of the messages here already today, and what it comforts me, I suppose, in some shape or form, that what we're seeing is continually aligning with the research that's taking place in the sector. It also is not comforting in any way whatsoever that young women still do remain invisible and are not quite considered in the way they need to be when we're thinking about designing and delivering services for them. Work done by Pippa and colleagues at the Association of Youth Justice, Agenda Alliance, has continued to re-articulate for us that young women are navigating systems that are not designed for them, and therefore their needs are not getting met. What we see as well, unfortunately, is the data sets that we rely on within criminal justice and youth justice, typically offending and knife crime data, misses the narrative of girls and young women. It gives us quite a binary kind of analysis, if you like, of the harm and the crime we're sort of talking around. And actually the ripple effect of that plays out in young women's lives often isn't reflected in data. We've talked about, we've had Janine talk about adultification and intersectionality. Interestingly, we've seen in our work in some of our group the difference of referrals into both group work and our one-to-one work. Our group work is typically working with younger girls. It's more preventative. It's looking for early signs of vulnerability to see if we can kind of get in there early and do some preventative work. Whereas our one-to-one work is typically working with young women where there's acute harm, acute safeguarding issues going on, where they've not been supported and opportunities have been missed, and therefore they're coming to notice in really acute scenarios. And we see an overrepresentation of Black girls being referred into our one-to-one work, i.e. when things get really bad, when there's violence and harm, and an underrepresentation of Black girls in our preventative work. And that's really interesting to me. And it really requires some curiosity there, which we're doing with our borough-based partners, to say, why is it that Black girls aren't showing up in those more preventative spaces? Is it because of oppressive nature of intersectionality and adultification, where their vulnerability profile is not being considered and is being missed, potentially on the basis of racialized bias and discrimination? So massive overlaps with our work that we've seen from previous speakers. I'm going to move us on because of time. There's lots of nuance here that we won't have time to go through today. But in terms of, Rachel asked the questions of Catherine earlier about actually what's specific for girls and young women, what we're seeing is different. We see on a regular basis this intersection of gender showing up very differently for girls. So we often see that they're the observers. They're sitting around the edges of male action and activity, around facilitating, observing, providing welfare response to the harm, where we think the main protagonists are boys and young men. We work a lot with young women who themselves are young mums, and they have children with males who are very dangerous and very concerning in our communities, and young women are put in an untenable situation where they are, on one hand, a threat from a very dangerous male who has an invested interest in that girl not engaging with statutory services that could shine a lens on his activities and his network's activities, and yet statutory services that ultimately have the legal powers to remove her child in order to protect that child. So she's in often a no-win situation and being asked to make changes to safeguard her child, which of course has to be a priority, but without a recognition actually of those extra familial contextual harms and risks that young woman's experiencing. We're working with partners in Islington, the team led by Aisling Barker, who are doing some really interesting work and data-led work to look at how offending, gangs and intimate partner abuse are intersecting in young people's lives. And we see that play out. Without fail, young women who are coming into particularly our one-to-one service have had normalised experiences of violence in their lives and domestic abuse, not just familial domestic abuse, but in their intimate partner relationships with boys and young men who are involved in gangs and offending. Again, I'm going to move us on. So in the context of that complexity,
Abby, can I just to let you know, we need to wrap up like any minute, just to make sure that we have enough time for questions, because I'm sure people will have lots of questions for you. So if you could just conclude your thoughts, that would be brilliant.
I will, no problem. I'm so sorry, Pippa. Just a final slide then on our practice framework that's rooted in our pillars of ecological, participatory, contextual and solution focused practice, which obviously I could talk a long time about. And my apologies, Pippa, for running over.
Thank you, Abby. And just for the benefit of the audience, we are going to be sending a number of links, including reports and links to the organisations that have been speaking today. So, Abby, if there's anything about Abby Ander's model of practice or anything else in terms of the activities of the organisation, we'll make sure that we follow that up so that colleagues have got an opportunity to find out more from you directly, if that's okay. Okay. All right then, well, that leaves me to introduce our second panelist who's been waiting patiently. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you our next speaker, who is Valerie Faulkner from, she leads the Girls Empowerment Team as their coordinator for Birmingham Youth Justice Service. Val holds a youth justice degree and has worked in various roles over 20 years, ranging from being a sessional worker, an ISS project worker, programme manager, and has now been the Girls Empowerment Team coordinator since 2013. So Val coordinates and supports a team of 3 dedicated female staff who offer daily support to all girls referred to the team on a voluntary basis. So Val specialises in work pertaining to girls from aged 10 to 18, which is child-focused, trauma-informed and holistically led. So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to you, Val, to tell us a bit more about the brilliant work that you're doing in Birmingham.
Thank you. I'm coming, I'm just trying to get my big screen on. Okay, here we go. Hi everyone. First of all, thank you for joining this webinar. I know time is against us, so I'm going to literally just whiz through these slides and hopefully it gives you a flavour of what we offer in Birmingham. So we support girls open to the YJS. Some girls are in care, living semi or independently, or in families where households are chaotic and deprived. Girls have had exposure to substance misuse, mental health, on neat or on reduced school timetables. Our service allows us to offer stability, ensuring regular contact, with a view to build a positive relationship to support or reduce offending. We strive to make positive changes whilst working in partnership with key agencies. We collaborate and discuss appropriate referrals to other partnership agencies to tailor interventions to suit the girls' needs. We aim to build resilience, structure, and manage vulnerability so they are no longer victims in their world. So what our service offer is, it's relationship based on a one-to-one basis, which allows girls to process their thoughts and feeling to be themselves. We offer emotional and practical support. With ongoing observations, girls can be eventually introduced to a small group of maximum of 6 if we do group work is necessary, and also if they want to be part of a group. So for us to deliver this piece of work, we do have a space in Birmingham, and that space, we look at the environment, so it has to be physically safety, location and clear boundary setting, holistic, addressing the whole girl approach, trauma-informed and child-focused, relationship-based, helping girls to establish significant relationships and build trust with a trusted adult, strength-based, teaching new skills by pro-social modelling and building on existing strengths, and health-based, addressing physical, sexual, mental and emotional health and recognising trauma. So what do we know about girls' adolescent development? Relationships are fundamental. They relate and work more effectively in a one-to-one setting. They tend to internalise failure, assume it's their fault and externalise success, have difficulty taking credit for success. And they also look to external sources for self-esteem. That could be social media, peers, or intergenerational family norms. So we offer a whole list of interventions. I'm not going to go through each one, but I think it's really important to say that all these interventions are chosen by each girl that we support. So because we already know their story, we've already read the assessment, we've already heard the professional understanding of that child through the assessment. But for us, we make sure that each child that comes through our front door has an offer of these interventions. And then once they've chosen their interventions, the girls will then sequence them in the importance to themselves. And that's really our buy-in, really, because they're then delivering, they're then doing interventions that are meaningful to them. Okay, so the importance of observations. Most of the girls referred for Get Support would not have been identified as having challenging, complex, chaotic lives, being victims of gang violence or sexual abuse if they had not come to the attention of YJF. Due to the assessment and holistic nature of the Get interventions, we aim to build a relationship with girls. Workers are constantly observing behaviours and listening to their lived experiences to tailor their individual needs and experiences to their interventions. So, I think it's really important to share the space where we deliver all our work in Birmingham. So just sit tight, and I've got a show, it's only a minute long, and then that will be the end of my presentation. And thank you for listening to me. Hi, my name is Valerie Faulkner, the Girls Empowerment Team Coordinator. Here are our new premises that we've moved into, based in Quayside Tower. We are located here on the 14th floor of a multi-purpose building, so there's no stigma to girls attending. Our girls' space is located close to Birmingham landmarks. We've got the library, the rep, and the International Convention Centre. Come take a walk with me. We are located here on Broad Street and easily accessible by bus, train or tram. This is the lobby area where you gain access with a fob. This is our space. We have 3 one-to-one spaces, a cosy corner, a touchdown office space, and a kitchen where girls can help themselves to light refreshments, and we can offer basic cooking skills. We also have access to a little exercise area where girls can take a break from their sessions and relax on the exercise bikes. This is the other side of the building, and this space can be booked for group work. Our girls love it here. Look at the view. This is the end of the tour, and please feel free to contact me if you want to come and see it in person. Hi, my name is Valerie. Sorry. Okay, that's the end of my presentation, everybody.
Thank you so much, Val. It was so lovely to see the space that you're working in. I'm sure people would have actually welcomed seeing it again. But thank you for giving us a real flavour of the work that you're doing in Birmingham and really kind of carving out for over a long period of time. You know, really your kind of model of practice and really kind of pushing things forward. Thank you for that.
I think it's really important to say to everyone on the webinar that this hasn't happened overnight. I've been working with girls since 2004 in lots of different scenarios, but we've really really led on this girl space in Birmingham. And like I said, it's, you know, I've sweated blood, sweat and tears to get to this point, but it's we're constantly finding new ways and ideas so we can support the girls the best we can.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much. I think what we're going to suggest that we do is I'm going to have a conversation with Susanna now about her review of Girls in Custody for about the next 10 minutes. Then if we are able to leave, and if I know that there's been questions coming in from the audience, which Rachel is pulling together. So if we compile those for all of our last 3 speakers in this section, and then if we do spill over past 4 o'clock a little bit, those that want to stay on, if there's any wiggle room in terms of those questions, they can do, but if not, then that's fine, but at least you'll get to hear all of the speakers today. So hopefully that's okay, and a slight change to our original schedule, but you know, we pivot and adapt. So I think if we can get Susanna up on the screen for everybody. Hi, Susanna.
Hi, good to see you, Pippa. Good to see everybody.
Good to see you too. Thank you for being with us. I will just briefly introduce you before getting stuck into asking you some questions about your review. So for anyone that doesn't know Susanna from her various different roles, she is a member of the Youth Justice Board and is also the Chief Executive of the National Fire Chiefs Council. She started her career as a probation officer working in London before moving to work in youth justice, managing youth offending teams in South London and going on to work in the YJB as head of performance. She then went on to be the assistant chief exec of the charity Victim Support and the CEO of the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners. Susanna recently undertook an independent review on behalf of the Youth Justice Minister into the placement of girls in the Youth Secure Estate. And the review and recommendations were published in February 2025. So for anybody that is on this call who has an interest in girls in the youth justice system, if you haven't read Susanna's review, then I would really recommend that you do that. And hopefully in our conversation today, we'll give a bit of a flavour of what Susanna did, what she found, what she recommended. But in terms of getting into the detail of that, please do have a look at her review, and we will send a link to that in follow-up for the day. So welcome, Susanna. It's great to have you here. Could you give everyone on the call just a bit of background about, from your perspective, what was the reason that the review was commissioned, and how did you feel about it when you were asked to lead it and to take it forward?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think this review has been a long time coming. And certainly both this government and previous governments have talked about doing a review into where girls are placed in custody. For some years now, there have been commitments to do it. but for all sorts of different reasons, I think it never happened. And certainly a number of organisations, and I'm sure some of them will be on this call, have been lobbying really, really hard for an independent review. One example, I guess, would be the Howard League, and that was particularly on the back of the decision made some years back that girls could be placed in YOIs, which is obviously not something that had happened historically. So I think there was a real head of steam to actually take stock and look at where girls were placed and get some clear recommendations coming out of it. I never expected that I would be asked to do the review. I'm a member of the Youth Justice Board. I worked in youth justice for a very long time, but I'm not currently working in that space other than in my Youth Justice Board role. But I was really delighted to be asked to do it, and it only took me about a fraction of a second to say yes. Such an important issue, and like many of you, all of you, I'm sure on the call, working with girls and young women in the justice system has been a very significant part of why I get up in the morning in a number of different roles. So I was really pleased to do it, Pippa, but also a little anxious about getting it right, because I knew there were a lot of people looking to this review to help move things forward. So I felt, quite a big responsibility.
I'm sure, and there's so much I could ask you, but I'm really keen for you to share with everybody how you approached the review in terms of who did you speak to, what data did you look at, what was it that I know that you were very comprehensive, so it'd be great if you could tell people a bit about how you sought to answer some of those really difficult and long-lasting questions.
Well, I know when I agreed to do it, I knew that I only wanted to do it if I could do it really sort of thoroughly and comprehensively. And actually, originally, the MOJ had agreed, I think it was 15 or 16 days to do it in, which really isn't very much time. And I ended up doing quite a bit more than that. And that was what I think it was, because I knew it was really important to do it justice. So I think to start with, I tried to speak to as many people as possible in terms of key stakeholders. And again, many of the organisations will be on this call, and people were so forthcoming with knowledge, with expertise, sharing reports. It was like a bit of a snowball. The more people I spoke to, the more information was sent to me. There is actually loads of research in this area. And I know, Pippa, I don't need to tell you this, but I was really surprised, but also pleased to see how much research was, maybe not specifically around where girls are placed, but certainly around the needs of girls in the justice system, both in custody and in the community. So there was loads of evidence and information for me to draw from. And actually, in some ways, I think a lot of the conclusions that I arrived at in my recommendations had already been well researched and prepared for me by many people. So I was, I think, as I said before, sort of standing on the shoulders of giants. So many of you had prepared all of the work, and I just needed to kind of land it, really, which is what I really tried to do.
And I was fortunate enough to be on a panel with you relatively recently, and also we sat alongside a wonderful young woman called Nardine, who I know that you spoke to as part of your review. And she really welcomed that, and I think really appreciated the opportunity to be involved. So can you tell us a bit about what you learned directly from the girls and young women that you spoke to, both those that are currently or at the time were in custody, and those that had experienced what the transition into various different contexts looked like since?
Yeah, definitely. So that was another really important aspect of the preparation of the review, and the review itself was talking to girls and young women, either currently in the youth justice system, in secure establishments, and those that used to be. And I visited a number of establishments, and wherever I went, other than Wetherby actually, because there weren't any girls there at the time, I spoke to the girls and young women who were in those establishments. And also through a lot of help and support from colleagues, was able to speak to some, like Nadine, who we met with, who were now thriving in the community, and were able to share their reflections back. I learned a huge amount from those conversations, and it reminded me of how important it is to talk to people that have lived experience. The vast majority of their experiences were really negative. and really difficult to hear. And will be many of the things that I'm sure you'll all be really aware of in terms of their experiences. They had very strong views around particularly YOIs and STCs, and about how inappropriate they were for girls, how often girls were overlooked and neglected, and what they need to really help them succeed and then thrive when they come back into the community, which led me on to all of the thinking and the discussion around gender responsive, gender inclusive services that are absolutely critical, I think, for not just girls in secure establishments, but girls throughout the youth justice system. And I think what also struck me was, for every single one of the girls that I spoke to, and there are so many others that I wasn't able to, unfortunately, to speak to, all of them had had some kind of care experience. Many of them had been placed in secure establishments as a welfare child before they were a justice child. And again, just a reminder to all of us, these are the same girls. They're just happened to land in one system rather than another. So working with them and supporting them in much more of a holistic way has got to be the way forward.
Thank you. And we're running out of time, so I know there's lots that I could ask you, but I'm going to choose my questions carefully. And there was a real range of recommendations in your review, one of which has already been successfully adopted in terms of the decision to remove girls out of Wetherby YOI, which was very welcomed by the sector. Could you talk us through any of the recommendations that you made that you'd particularly like to highlight? And I'm really keen if you can share if there's any that you think will be particularly challenging in terms of their implementation, that you foresee there might be most issues in terms of seeing them through to implementation.
Yes, I mean, maybe I'd sort of put them maybe in two buckets, really. The first is really where we place girls. As you've said, Pippa, really clear, there's no way that girls should be placed in YOIs, and it was great that the Justice Minister has already agreed to that. My second recommendation was that girls shouldn't be placed in secure training centres, and that when the Oak Hill contract comes to an end, or before that, if possible, girls shouldn't be placed in STCs. And that we should be looking to really improve our gender responsive services, focusing specifically on secure children's homes and the Near Secure School. And with that in mind, my recommendation is that we develop a consortia of establishments that become really skilled and expert in working with girls. So whenever a girl needs to be placed, that consortia works together to work out where there's space and where's the best place for that girl to work. So to be based. So working as a system rather than the kind of on an individual basis. And there was lots of interest and appetite for doing that from the secure children's homes, albeit I recognise that it's a little bit of a tricky period because they're all renegotiating their contracts. So it'll be really interesting to see where the Ministry of Justice goes with that recommendation and how we can make it work. But I guess the other wider bucket was about working much more constructively in the community. So thinking about many more opportunities to place girls in supported accommodation in the community rather than putting them in secure establishments. So there was recommendations about how we could work better with welfare providers, local authorities, children's social care on that. And perhaps one really important one for this group is that there is no strategy for girls in the youth justice system. Nothing exists about how we should be working with girls right across the system, from prevention, early intervention to those in custody. So it seems to me that is mission critical, really, if we're going to move this forward.
I'm delighted to hear you say that, Susanna, having made that recommendation myself at various points over many years. And before we open up to Q&A, and just to say thank you and goodbye to colleagues that do need to hard stop at 4 o'clock, could you just share with us, there's been hundreds of people on the call today who are clearly all interested and passionate and taking a big chunk of their day out to listen to us to discuss these issues. So in order to get more of that strategic focus on girls in custody in terms of adoption of your recommendations, and also more widely, what can we do as interested individuals and organisations in the sector to keep on pushing forward to make sure that we do get that real intentional focus that I spoke about when I was doing the context setting a couple of hours ago?
Well, I think if we could find a way to use the energy and insights from this group to, form whether it's a working group or a task and finish group, I'm sure there must be ways for us to come together to start to imagine what that girl's strategy would look like. I think we've got, everybody we need really on this call to help move that forward. So that would be a fantastic outcome of this session, I think.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, we've got 1 minute to 4. So for colleagues that do need to hop off and go elsewhere, thank you very much for joining us. And we've done our best to keep to time, but when you've got all of these fantastic people here talking about such interesting topics, it's hard to rein ourselves in. But Rachel, I'm presuming that there's been some questions popping in the Q&A for Susanna and potentially for Abby and Val as well. So can I hand over to you to see whether we've got any questions for others, if colleagues are happy to stay on for a couple of minutes in order to do so?
Yeah, thank you, Pippa. There was a question. There's been a couple of comments for you, Val, around could you please share the link to the lovely video that you put in your presentation, giving a nice little tour of your girls' space. So if you can share that with Pippa and I, we'll certainly send it out with the rest of the links that our guest speakers have referred to in terms of published work and any resources. So that's nice. People obviously interested in looking around your girls' space. And I know at the end of that video you said you're welcome visitors. I had a question for you, Val, around would you work with any victims if they were identified, particularly girls? So I'll just hand over to you to answer that one, please.
We do work with victims referred in through our restorative service. So yeah, but again, we don't particularly update our for the sensitive nature. So we don't update our database. So we do the one-to-one work, and then all of that work that we do is then shared with that practitioner, and then they will update the records on there. Just because obviously our databases have the children that we work with who have made mistakes and also the victims. But we do.
Thanks, Val. There was quite a large question for the network on here around evidence and research on girls and experiences of alternative learning provisions. It's come from Charlotte. Charlotte, what I'll do is I'll share that lengthy question and comment with the group. I've been trying to reflect on it whilst Susanna, Abby and Val have been speaking, but just asking around, do we need girl-specific education spaces, and then how in terms of girls' exclusion rates in comparisons to boys. You did apologise, it was long-winded thoughts, but still I think it's really valid, so I will share that with the group if that's okay with you, just to reflect on after. Just a comment around Ofsted focuses on practice with girls as part of our inspections and will continue to do so. So that's from Sean. So thank you very much from that. And Sean has also just commented, Susanna, that it was good to discuss your findings with you, and hoping that as soon as possible there'll be a girls' strategy in place for the secure estate. I'm just going to check the in review. One final question we've got is just a comment, I suppose. I feel that as professionals, we have always known that multi-agency work is the only way to create more effective services. So what is it that is actually holding us back from it? A good reflection from Louise. We keep talking about systemic change, but what does that look like in a practical sense? This is also for intersectional work. What is stopping many organisations, especially trauma-informed ones, incorporating these measures? So lots of reflections in the chat. I don't know whether anybody wants to pick up on it, any of those reflections, but we are collating these into a bit of a Word document. So if anybody's asked a question and they feel like it hasn't been answered, rest assured that we are collating them and we'll post them to everybody that's been very grateful enough to speak today on today's webinar. Pippa, I'll hand back to you.
Yeah, I just wondered, Abby, did you want to say anything in terms of what working in a contextual way actually looks like in practice? I know that that's part of the model that you've been developing over a long time at Abbey Under, and how that fits in alongside statutory services such as where the work that Val was describing earlier.
Yeah, thanks, Pippa. I mean, we've been on quite a journey with this, because actually our first ever one-to-one service, which was the STAR project in Islington, was from the get-go co-located in what was then called the transitions team, and that was working with 16 to 24-year-olds who were on the top 50 on the then gangs matrix. And we were asked to go in and to provide a gender-specific kind of way of working in one-to-one service with girls who might have either been on the matrix, which was very rare. I think in our time there's like 1 or 2 young women on the top 50, but that were associated in some way with the males on the matrix. So there was, to start with, there was this sort of, which was in Islington, that felt like a really, this was in sort of 2012, quite a proactive sense from leadership, which obviously we know is always really key in doing effective kind of multidisciplinary work that's underpinned by certain values, and in this instance intersectionality, and a sort of awareness around that is incited, but that it felt like there was a really sort of proactive sense of, we know we don't know stuff about girls and young women and how they're impacted by these issues, but we know we've got a responsibility to do that digging and actually lift the stone, which obviously a lot of reports, particularly across the CSE, have said that people there's not been enough professional curiosity. So I think that was the sort of starting values, I suppose, which was so important. I mean, our work, sits within multidisciplinary teams. So we sit alongside youth justice, probation, specialist social workers, police gangs teams, mental health support, and within that, and I think it's always a challenge. Not claiming that we've got it brilliantly right, but there needs to be one, I think, an acceptance that we're all working from very different agendas and also values positions across different institutions and organisations, some with statutory responsibility, some with not, but also that there has to be a transference of learning and setting up systems and processes within those multidisciplinary teams. It's very easy just to still work in silo, even though you're in a co-located multidisciplinary team. Actually, what are the systems and processes that really try to generate transference of learning, sharing of specialist knowledge? I could go on and on, but for time I won't. But yeah, we very much sit alongside a statutory offer and support by doing that sort of specialist work with girls and young women alongside statutory partners.
Thanks, Abby. I think we've just got one final one. It's to sort of everybody, all the presenters, Ella, including yourself. Do the presenters feel that enough is being done to educate girls about the risks of harm and vulnerabilities that Janine highlighted? There's a bit of an emphasis on targeting men not to be perpetrators, so as not to give the responsibility to girls to protect themselves. But they're asking, is enough being done to support girls in identifying those risks? Don't know who wants to come in on that, if anybody does.
Can I come in? It's Val. I don't think enough is being done. I do think, talking from a youth justice point of view, girls have interactions with lots of other services before coming through our front door process. And I just think there's lots of opportunity to disrupt and to educate the girls, whether that be in schools or various agencies that have been referred to. So I do think we could all work a lot harder to raise the awareness across the board.
Did anyone else want to come in on that question before we wrap up?
I could, but Ella, do you want to? Sorry, I don't want to take up the space. Is there anything you would want to add?
Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, we really focus on the development of independence and agency for our young women, which is really rooted in developing a critical consciousness and critical thinking. As like Val talked about it in terms of skills development for girls and young women, and we see critical thinking as a fundamental skill to support young women in developing. So yeah, so they can think more critically about the systems and spaces they move within, between. They can think more critically about gendered pressures, expectations, bias, discrimination, and much more broadly than that as well. But also what we push for organisationally is that actually it has to go beyond that behavioural shift for young women. Actually, we need to be working with boys and young men as well, and we need to be working in the spaces to increase safety and conditions for safety for girls and young women, but in that co-located space that I talked about, alongside us, for example, targeted youth support colleagues or youth justice colleagues or gangs workers, is actually really working with our colleagues to say, well, how are you talking to boys and young men about their relationships? And we're seeing a much greater emergence of triangulation between boys' involvement in offending, gang association, and intimate partner abuse, either perpetrating violence towards their parents, typically mums, or within their own intimate and sexual relationships. So it's absolutely essential we take it outside of the work we're doing with girls and young women, whilst at the same time obviously focusing on that skill development for girls as well.
And in the much needed strategy that Susanna mentioned, that should encompass what's happening within the secure estate and much more broadly, not just within the youth justice system, but all of the other systems that cross over with it. It's really important that we consider exactly what you've just been talking about. And while it is incredibly important to consider girls in their own right, and that's why we're having this conversation today, I think that particularly those issues really highlight the fact that we need to make sure that we're pushing forward with a gender-informed approach to working with children and young people more broadly, for all of this to kind of really come together in their best interest. So brilliant. Thank you.
Can I just add to something that Abby brought up, in that I think I'd like to reflect on the fact that many of the issues and many of the recommendations that were made in the research that we did at Shift with girls specifically, many of those findings really resonate with boys in contact with the youth justice system as well. So, you know, boys are over-criminalised too, and Black boys are also overrepresented, and they also have trauma histories as well. And also kind of difficult to speak out about those experiences. So although this is a really important focus on girls, I think that many of the things that we were finding in the report and the recommendations that were being made can also apply to boys in the youth justice system as well.
Thanks, Ella. Okay, well, there's still 130 odd people on the call, but I do think that we should probably wrap up and let you all get on with the rest of your day. So that just leaves us to say thank you so much to everybody that's attended, those that are here and those that were with us at various points earlier. Thank you particularly to all of our speakers for sharing all of the insights from a real range of different perspectives. We've covered a lot of ground today and we could have probably had a whole day, so long may the conversation continue. And if I might just thank and pass over to my co-host, co-presenter, partner in crime, Rachel. So thank you, Rachel, for all of your work in collaborating with us to put this together. And is there anything you'd like to say in terms of a final word from the YJB?
Just a huge thank you. It's the start of a really big conversation that we need to keep going, and I think there's definitely appetite and passion in the room from what we've heard throughout the afternoon to keep that going, and just a massive thank you for joining us, but also to our speakers for speaking so honestly and candidly and taking questions from not only Pippa and I but from the audience, and a huge thank you to Pippa for leading me on this journey with her, and yeah, just being a critical friend at points but also very, very supportive. So a huge thank you to you, Pippa.
Great. thanks everyone. And as we've said, we'll follow up with the slides, the relevant links, and seeking some of your feedback, so which we will really welcome. So thank you so much.
Thanks everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.